Chapter 1, The 60-Second Gamble. The air in the grand ballroom of the Vane estate was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the suffocating pressure of a dying man's whim. Silas Vane, the youngest billionaire to ever grace the cover of Forbes, checked his watch. The second hand was a guillotine. 60 seconds, Silas, his father's lawyer whispered, his voice as dry as the parchment he held. If you are not married by the stroke of midnight, the Vane empire passes to your cousin. The board has already signed the papers. 1 minute to save your life's work. Silas didn't believe in fate, he believed in strategy. His fiancée, Elena, was supposed to be waiting behind the heavy velvet curtains of the alcove, draped in the family's heirloom lace. They had planned this, a quick, legal ceremony to secure his inheritance before his father's archaic marriage clause expired. But a sudden blackout had plunged the estate into chaos only moments ago. He lunged through the curtains into the darkness. His hands found soft silk and a delicate frame. The scent wasn't the roses Elena usually wore, it was something sharper, like sandalwood and rain, but there was no time to think. The lawyer is here. Don't speak, just nod, Silas hissed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled her toward the small circle of candlelight where the official stood. The woman was silent, her face completely obscured by an antique floor-length veil. Outside the alcove, he could hear his cousin's triumphant laughter, counting down the final 30 seconds. Do you, Silas Vane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, Silas barked, his eyes fixed on the clock. And do you, the official turned to the veiled figure, take this man to be your husband? A moment of agonizing silence followed. Silas squeezed her hand, a silent plea, a command, a desperate gamble. Finally, a small, gloved hand squeezed back, and a soft, steady voice whispered, I do. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may seal it with a kiss. Silas didn't hesitate. He needed this to be undeniable. He reached out, cupped the woman's face through the lace, and kissed her with a ferocity born of pure adrenaline. It was a victory kiss, the taste of a billion-dollar empire saved. But as the lights flickered back to life, the ballroom didn't erupt in cheers. It fell into a haunting, icy silence. Silas pulled back, his brow furrowing as he looked at the woman in his arms. The lace felt different. Through the thin fabric, he saw eyes that weren't the soft brown of his fiancée. They were a piercing, stormy blue, eyes he had spent the last 5 years trying to forget. With a trembling hand, he threw back the veil. The room gasped. Elena, his actual fiancée, stood in the doorway of the ballroom, her face pale, her own wedding dress torn at the hem as if she'd been delayed. But the woman Silas had just legally married was Bianca Rossi, Elena's estranged half-sister, his family's fiercest business rival, and the only woman who had ever dared to publicly humiliate him. Silas let go of her as if she were made of fire. The legal document on the table was already signed. The ink was dry. Bianca? He whispered, the horror dawning on him. Bianca straightened her silk gown, her blue eyes flashing with a mix of triumph and something that looked dangerously like tragedy. She looked at the shocked crowd, then back at Silas. You should have checked the scent, Silas, she said, her voice cool and unbreakable. Elena prefers roses. I prefer the truth. The clock struck midnight. The inheritance was saved, but as Silas looked at his new wife, he realized the war had only just begun. Chapter 2. The unveiling of the rival. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt physical. Silas stood frozen, the gold wedding band on his finger feeling like a brand. Across the room, Elena's bouquet hit the floor with a soft, hollow thud. Silas. Elena's voice was a broken whisper. What have you done? Silas turned to the lawyer, desperation clawing at his throat. This is a mistake. The darkness, the confusion, this ceremony is void. I intended to marry Elena. This woman, she's an interloper. The lawyer, a man who had seen 40 years of vain family scandals, didn't look up from the marriage certificate. He pointed to the bottom of the page. Intent matters in spirit, Silas, but in the eyes of the vain trust, signatures matter in ink. You signed. She signed. The witness saw a voluntary kiss. Under the strict terms of your father's will, if you divorce or annul this marriage within the first year, the entire inheritance is forfeited immediately. Silas felt the walls closing in. He looked at Bianca. She wasn't crying. She wasn't apologizing. She stood with her shoulders back, her gaze fixed on a point just above the crowd's heads. Why were you back there, Bianca? Silas hissed, stepping closer so only she could hear. Was this a play for the money? Did you follow Elena into the dark to steal her life? Bianca finally looked at him. There was a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, before it was replaced by a mask of cold iron. I wasn't following her, Silas. I was hiding from the reporters outside. I didn't ask you to grab me. I didn't ask you to drag me to an altar. But when you whispered that you needed me to save your life's work, I realized I finally had the leverage to save mine. The rivalry between Silas and Bianca wasn't just business, it was blood. Years ago, Silas's father had crushed Bianca's mother's shipping company in a hostile takeover, leaving them with nothing while he raised Elena, the preferred daughter, in luxury. Bianca had spent 5 years clawing her way back up, becoming the only person who could outmaneuver Silas in a boardroom. Leverage? Silas gripped her arm, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. You think you've won? You're tied to a man who despises you. And you, Bianca countered, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands, are married to the woman who knows where all your company's bodies are buried. You want your inheritance? You'll have to play house with the enemy. The confrontation was cut short by the sound of shutters clicking. The press had arrived. The mistake of the century was about to go global. Silas knew he had two choices: admit the mistake and lose the multi-billion-dollar vain empire to his treacherous cousin, or lean into the lie. He looked at Elena, who was being led away in tears by her mother. Then he looked at the cameras. With a jaw set so tight it ached, Silas reached out and took Bianca's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Her skin was ice cold. Smile, Bianca, he whispered through a forced, photogenic grin. The world is watching. I never smile for free, Silas, she replied, but she turned to the cameras anyway, looking every bit the regal, mysterious bride. As they were whisked away to a waiting limousine, Silas realized the complexity of his situation. He wasn't just dealing with a legal contract, he was trapped in a house with a woman who had every reason to want to see him fall. He had grabbed a woman in the dark to save his future, only to realize he had invited a wolf into his heart. Chapter 3: Paper Walls and Iron Hearts. The heavy oak doors of the vain mansion swung shut, echoing like a prison cell closing. The drive from the gala had been spent in a suffocating, stony silence, broken only by the incessant buzzing of Silas's phone as the world reacted to the secret wedding of the year. Inside the master suite, the air felt thin. Silas ripped off his tuxedo jacket and threw it onto a velvet armchair. He turned to Bianca, who was struggling with the tiny, intricate pearl buttons at the back of her borrowed wedding dress. Don't get comfortable, Silas snapped, pacing the length of the Persian rug. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. You'll stay in the East Wing. We see each other for public appearances, for board meetings, and for the lawyers. Otherwise, you don't exist to me. Bianca stopped fumbling with her buttons. She looked at him through the vanity mirror, her reflection pale and exhausted. The east wing is undergoing renovations, Silas. Your father ordered it stripped last week. If your cousin's private investigators see lights in 2 different wings of this house, the accidental vows will be flagged as fraud before sunrise. Silas stopped pacing. He cursed under his breath. His cousin, Marcus, was already circling the estate like a shark sensing blood. Any hint that this wasn't a passionate, impulsive marriage would trigger a forensic audit of the wedding night. Fine, Silas growled. 1 room. But I'm taking the sofa. Like hell you are, Bianca said, her voice regaining its sharp edge. She turned around, her dress slipping slightly at the shoulders. I didn't spend the last 5 years fighting your company's lawyers to spend my wedding night on a floor. This is a 5,000 square foot suite. Stay on your side of the bed. As the night wore on, the tension shifted from anger to a strange, vibrating awareness. Silas watched as Bianca finally managed to unstick a stubborn lace thread. For a moment, his rival didn't look like a corporate shark. She looked small. He saw the faint, jagged scar on her shoulder, a remnant of the car accident that had occurred the night his father had finalized the takeover of her mother's company. Why did you really say, I do? Silas asked, his voice lower now, devoid of the earlier venom. You hate my family. You could have walked away and watched me lose everything. That would have been your ultimate revenge. Bianca sat on the edge of the massive silk-covered bed, staring at her bare feet. If you lose the company, Marcus takes over. Marcus doesn't just want to win, Silas, he wants to destroy. He would liquidate the shipping yards. Thousands of people my mother used to employ, would lose their pensions. I didn't marry you to save you. I married you to keep the vain empire in the hands of someone who at least has a soul, even if it is buried under layers of ice. Silas felt a strange prickle of respect, a sensation he found deeply irritating. He had spent years picturing Bianca as a villain, a ghost from his father's past coming to haunt his ledgers. He hadn't considered that her bitterness was rooted in a sense of justice. I loved Elena, Silas said, though even to his own ears, the word felt more like a habit than a truth. No, you loved the idea of Elena, Bianca countered, looking up at him with those piercing blue eyes. She's easy. She's quiet. She never challenges you. You didn't want a wife, you wanted a gold-plated shadow. She stood up, walking past him toward the bathroom to wash away the night's makeup. As she passed, that scent of sandalwood and rain flared again, hitting him harder than the adrenaline at the altar. Silas lay in the dark later that night, listening to the steady breathing of the woman on the other side of the bed. The walls of the mansion were thick, built of stone and history, but the paper walls, between them, the lies, the contracts, the rivalries, were starting to feel dangerously thin. He had expected a war of words. He hadn't expected the quiet tragedy of her presence to keep him awake. Chapter 4, The Sabotage. The honeymoon period didn't exist. Instead, the Vane estate became a fortress under siege. By Monday morning, the tabloids were calling it the stolen altar, and the stock market was twitching. Silas was in his study, staring at a screen of plummeting red numbers, when the door burst open. It wasn't Bianca. It was Elena, but not the sweet, docile Elena he had intended to marry. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she was flanked by Silas's cousin, Marcus. I hope you're happy, Silas, Elena spat, throwing a tabloid onto his desk. The headline showed Silas and Bianca's victory kiss under the veil. I spent 3 years being the perfect partner, only for you to choose her in the dark. Elena, it was a mistake. We're working on a solution, Silas said, his voice weary. A solution? Or a cover-up? Marcus stepped forward, a shark-like grin stretching across his face. The board is concerned, Silas. They're hearing rumors that you and your new bride aren't even sharing a meal, let alone a life. I've filed a formal petition for a marital authenticity audit. In 48 hours, an investigator will be living here. If they find one shred of evidence that this is a sham, the inheritance shifts to me. After they swept out, the room felt cold. Silas found Bianca in the library, staring out the window at the rain. He told her about the audit. They're going to look for gaps, Bianca said, her voice tight. They'll interview the staff. They'll look at our schedules. They'll look for the lack of affection. Then we give them affection, Silas said, though the words felt heavy in his mouth. The sabotage started that evening. It was subtle at first, a leaked, anonymous tip that Bianca was still seen at her old apartment, then a doctored audio recording of them arguing. Marcus was trying to bait them into a public blowout. The pressure culminated at the Vain Charity Gala on Wednesday night. Every camera in the city was aimed at the entrance. As they stepped out of the car, Silas felt Bianca's hand tremble on his arm. Don't let them see, he whispered, pulling her closer. Suddenly, a waiter, hired by Marcus, tripped, sending a tray of red wine flying toward Bianca's white dress. It was a calculated move to humiliate her, to make her snap and show the rival side of her personality. But Silas was faster. He stepped in front of her, the wine soaking into his custom-made tuxedo instead. The crowd gasped. Silas! Bianca cried, her mask of coldness slipping for the first time. She reached out, using her own silk wrap to dab at the stain on his chest. It's just a suit, Bianca, Silas said, looking down at her. In that moment, he wasn't acting. He saw the genuine worry in her eyes, the way she instinctively moved to protect him even though she had every reason to want him stained. You ruined your favorite jacket for me, she murmured, her voice soft enough that the microphones couldn't catch it. I'd ruin 100 more, Silas replied, surprised by the honesty in his own voice. Across the room, he saw Marcus's face turn a furious shade of purple. The sabotage had backfired. By protecting the woman he was supposed to hate, Silas had given the world, and the investigator, the most convincing, authentic moment possible. But as they danced later that night, Silas felt a different kind of danger. The conflict wasn't just external anymore. The paper walls weren't just thin, they were burning. We're getting too good at this, Bianca whispered as he spun her across the floor. Is that a bad thing? Silas asked. It is when you forget it's a game, she replied, though she didn't pull away. The night ended with a victory in the press, but a defeat in Silas's heart. He was supposed to be saving an empire. Instead, he was starting to realize that the empire felt empty, and the wrong person was the only thing making it feel like home. Chapter 5, The Price of the Inheritance. The marital authenticity audit was reaching its final, grueling hours. The investigator, a stone-faced woman named Agent Miller, had been trailing Silas and Bianca for 2 days, documenting every glance and every shared meal. The tension in the Vain estate was a live wire, ready to snap. Just as Silas began to believe they might make it, Marcus made his final, desperate move. He didn't come with threats or cameras this time. He arrived at the estate with a single, manila envelope. He found Silas and Bianca in the dining room, just as Agent Miller was finishing her notes. You've played a beautiful game, Silas, Marcus said, tossing the envelope onto the table. But even the best players get played. You think your bride ended up behind that curtain by accident? You think she's a victim of circumstance? Silas felt a cold pit form in his stomach. He looked at Bianca, her face had gone deathly pale. Open it, Marcus urged. Silas pulled out a series of time-stamped photos and a digital log. They showed Bianca entering the Vain estate 20 minutes before the blackout. More importantly, they showed her standing near the main circuit breaker. The logs proved the blackout hadn't been a fluke of the storm, it had been triggered manually. She didn't get lost in the dark, Silas, Marcus sneered. She created the dark. She knew about the 60-second clause. She sidelined Elena, cut the power, and waited in the alcove for you to grab her. She didn't marry you to save the shipyards. She married you to dismantle your life from the inside out. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. He turned to Bianca, his voice a jagged edge. Is it true? Did you pull the switch? Bianca's eyes were brimming with tears, but she didn't look away. I went to the breaker room, yes. I wanted to delay the wedding because I had proof that Elena was working with Marcus to sell off the company the moment the papers were signed. I wanted to stop a disaster, Silas. I never intended to be the one you grabbed. I was trying to save you from a trap, but I ended up becoming the trap myself. A likely story, Marcus laughed. She's a Rossi. Sabotage is in her blood. The silence that followed was suffocating. Agent Miller watched them, her pen hovering over the fraud box on her report. Silas looked at the photos, then at the woman he had started to let into his heart. Everything pointed to a betrayal. Every instinct he had as a businessman told him to cut her loose and save himself. But then, he looked at her hands. They were shaking, not with the guilt of a con artist, but with the terror of someone who was about to lose the only person who finally saw her for who she was. Silas, she whispered. I didn't do it for the money. I did it because I couldn't let them destroy you. Silas looked at Marcus, who was already reaching for the investigator's pen, victory gleaming in his eyes. Silas realized then that the price of the inheritance wasn't $1 billion. It was the cost of trust. The logs are real, Silas said, his voice echoing in the hall. Marcus cheered, but Silas wasn't finished. The logs are real, but the context is wrong. I asked Bianca to check the breakers. I knew the storm was coming. She was acting on my orders. What? Marcus's face fell. That's a lie. You're perjuring yourself. I'm protecting my wife, Silas said, stepping beside Bianca and placing a firm, protective hand on her waist. He looked Agent Miller dead in the eye. My cousin has spent weeks trying to manufacture a scandal because he's unfit to lead. My marriage is legal, it is intentional, and if you check your notes from the last 48 hours, you'll see that it is very, very real. Agent Miller looked from the frantic Marcus to the calm, resolute Silas. She slowly closed her folder and stood up. The audit is closed, she announced. The marriage stands. The inheritance is secure. As Marcus was escorted out by security, screaming about lawsuits and revenge, Bianca turned to Silas, her face wet with tears. Why? You knew I wasn't telling the whole truth. Why did you save me? Silas looked at the woman he had mistakenly kissed in the dark, realizing she was the only bright thing in his life. Because $1 billion is a lot of money, Bianca. But it's not worth losing the only person who's actually been on my side. The victory was won, but as they stood in the empty dining room, the weight of the truth remained. They had saved the empire, but they hadn't yet saved themselves. Chapter 6, The New Legacy. The war for the Vane Empire ended not with a shout, but with a quiet signature. With the audit cleared and Marcus officially barred from the estate, the house should have felt like a victory lap. Instead, it felt like a museum, cold, grand, and hollow. Silas stood on the balcony overlooking the sprawling grounds. The 1-year mark of the inheritance clause was still months away, but for the first time in his life, the money felt like paper. He heard the soft click of heels on the stone floor. Bianca stood there, no longer in the borrowed lace of arrival, but in her own sharp, navy suit. She held a suitcase in her hand. The lawyers processed the temporary separation agreement, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the sandalwood scent he had grown to crave. Since the audit is over and the board has confirmed your seat as CEO, I've arranged to stay at my old apartment. We'll show up for the quarterly galas, but you have your life back, Silas. You're safe. Silas didn't turn around. Is that what you think this was about? Being safe? It's what you wanted, she reminded him. You wanted a strategy. You wanted to save your legacy. Silas finally turned, his gaze intense. My legacy was a pile of stones and a name people feared. You were right that night in the library, I wanted a shadow. But you didn't give me a shadow, Bianca. You gave me a mirror. You showed me that I was turning into the same man who destroyed your mother's company. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. The suitcase between them felt like a canyon. I don't want the separation agreement. And I don't want the accidental part of our vows anymore. Bianca searched his eyes, her breath hitching. Silas, we started with a lie. A blackout and a mistake. You can't build a life on a 60-second gamble. Then let's start at second 61, Silas whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside wasn't the Vane family heirloom lace or a ring chosen for a business arrangement. It was a simple, stunning emerald, the color of the Atlantic in a storm. I didn't choose this for a CEO's wife. I chose this for the woman who was brave enough to pull the lever in the dark just to give me a chance to see the truth. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Bianca Rossi, I've already married you once for the wrong reasons. Will you stay with me for the right ones? Not for an inheritance, and not for a company. Just for me. The iron mask Bianca had worn for years finally shattered. A genuine, radiant smile broke across her face, the kind of smile Silas realized he wanted to spend the next 50 years earning. I told you once that I never smile for free, Silas, she teased, though her eyes were shining with tears. Name your price, he replied, grinning. Stay, she said. Just stay. They didn't need a grand ballroom or a ticking clock this time. Under the warm glow of the afternoon sun, Silas leaned in and kissed his wife, not to seal a contract, and not to fool an investigator, but to begin a legacy that was entirely their own. The wrong bride had turned out to be the only person who was ever right. The Vane empire continued to grow, but it changed. Under Silas and Bianca's joint leadership, it became a company defined by integrity rather than conquest. And every year, on the anniversary of the Great Blackout, Silas would turn off all the lights in the mansion, just to remind himself that sometimes, the best things in life are found when you're forced to stop looking with your eyes and start looking with your heart. Join the conversation. What a journey! From a desperate 60-second gamble to a love that redefined an empire. Accidental vows proves that sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the greatest destinies. What did you think of Silas's choice? Would you have forgiven Bianca for pulling the lever, or was she right to do it to save him from a trap? Drop a comment below and let's discuss the twists and turns of this wrong bride romance. If you enjoyed this full romance audiobook, don't forget to like this video if you love the ending. Subscribe to the channel for more captivating, high-stakes romance stories. Share this video with a friend who loves a good enemies to lovers trope. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.